Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. And of course, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this really important topic of the nexus between disaster and conflict. And countries that are associated with fragility, with conflict and violence, what we call the FCV countries, often face a really heightened risk from disaster because government capacity is weakened. And on the other hand, disaster risk can, of course, exacerbate pre-existing tensions, increasing the risk of violence. So what we call, natural disasters, climate risk being an amplifier of underlying fragility, and thereby that nexus is really something that we need to look at. On top of this overall vulnerability, of course, again, we're looking at the impacts of climate change and really looking at how this multiplies the risk for countries dealing with conflict in both the immediate, but also in the long term. The other thing, of course, which is really important for us at the World Bank Group, is that climate change disproportionately affects the poorest and the most vulnerable communities, especially those, of course, living in fragile and conflict-affected environments. And our own research, I think many of you have seen it, are familiar with the different reports that we've come out with over the last few years, but recent research has shown that over 216 million people are at risk of migration, of moves within their own countries in every region that we work in, from sub-Saharan Africa to South Asia, as a result of climate risk. So again, just that migration, involuntary migration due to climate risk, feeds into underlying fragility and conflict. So really, the starting point is that you really cannot have an approach that considers disaster risk in isolation. And that's why both the World Bank and GFDRR really considers disasters, conflict, and climate as interrelated factors and have an integrated strategic approach to deal with them. Compounded disaster conflict risk is a cross-cutting theme in both the new GFDRR strategy for 2021 to 2025, as well as the World Bank's 2020 FCV strategy. And these documents really underline the World Bank and GFDR's commitment to helping countries and communities tackle the intersecting risks of conflict and disasters as they strive towards a more resilient future. These strategies have also informed disaster risk management efforts on the ground, of course, including those supported by GFDRR. So, for example, a World Bank analysis funded through GFDR in South Sudan found that in several communities, the increase in the severity of floods and droughts appears to have contributed to a corresponding rise in the numbers of community-level conflicts. And that is, of course, not a big surprise to those of us who are working on this in the day-to-day. What we find, of course, even more so is that women, girls, and internally displaced populations were found to be most vulnerable to these compound risks. And this analysis is expected to then inform the development of the country's disaster risk management strategy. And this is just one example, of course, of how we do have to roll out this kind of work in the other fragile countries that we're working in. GFDRR is also increasing its investments in FCV countries over the years, including through its analytic work, precisely because of how critical the nexus between FCV and DRM is. So from FY16 to FY21, GFDRR supported DRM activities in 38 countries categorized as fragile and conflict affected, and this contributed to mobilize approximately $1.8 billion US dollars in funding through World Bank investments. The bank has also really enhanced its analytical capacity to engage in fragile situations through its risk and resilience assessments, which have now become the primary diagnostic tool informing and shaping FCV sensitivity in country strategies. But there's, of course, a lot more that can be done on this agenda, starting with the recognition that disaster conflict nexus warrants serious attention, and that's why today's conversation is so important. So there's a need for more funding to better understand how hazard, shocks, and stresses interact and how they impact policy making and resource allocation. And really also, the sort of starting point is that strengthening analytical and evidence bases will be absolutely a must to develop a dedicated and targeted policy and strategic framework that can then translate into concrete actions on the ground. So despite these uncertain times, climate change, disasters, and conflict, unfortunately, remain among the few certainties that we know we will have to deal with, especially in the near future. And GFDR is reorienting its interventions to offer more specialized and customized solutions in FCV context, including for crisis preparedness. So this is a really important undertaking, and we're counting on your continued support to make this happen, and really looking forward to the discussion in this session that is to come. So thank you very much again for having me here today, and look forward to hearing the readout from this session. Thank you.